Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Wanderback Live. We took a little break from doing these Wanderback Lives, which are our fireside chats where we want to get a little bit more into what's happening in the whiskey world and a little bit of education, a little bit of fun. And it seems very appropriate that given many of us are facing some more severe COVID kind of restrictions, that this happens to be the day that we are relaunching Wanderback Live. So I think it's going to be a lovely thing for this fall and winter season. So we're delighted to have everybody here. Welcome. Today we are going to talk about how to taste whiskey. And we are going to be sharing some tools with you that will help you taste whiskey. One of these is a tasting wheel. This is actually a tasting wheel that Phil discovered when he was doing his studies at Heriot Watt in Edinburgh. So it is the wheel that they use. And I really like it because it's a very practical way of tasting the whiskey. So needless to say, tasting whiskey is a little bit different from just enjoying it. And it can be a little bit more intimidating. So we hope that after today's Wanderback Live, those of you who are new to kind of formally tasting whiskey will have a little bit more idea of how to do it and feel a little bit more confident. Today we are going to be tasting with batch number 4. So this is what we're going to demonstrate with. So if any of you out there have batch number 4, then please pour yourself a glass and cheers and taste along with us. And we'd love to hear what you have to say in the chat box. So please do that. So it's not going to be me who is going to be taking us through the tasting, because I do not claim to be very good at this. I'm definitely learning, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot tonight. But instead, we are going to have Anna Hines, who is one of our Wanderback virtual brand ambassadors, do the tasting and the education for us. Hi, Anna.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fabulous. How are you?
I'm very, very good. So some of you may know that what we have done during COVID is we haven't been out to give people tastings out in the community. We've actually been going virtual. And so we do virtual tastings for groups. And Anna is one of our virtual ambassadors who leads these tastings. And she always gets a lot of questions, right, Anna, about learning more about how to taste. So that's why we thought we would do this. So I'm very thankful, Anna, that you are leading this discussion today. And then just to make it even more female power and women drinking whiskey, our second guest is Nikki from Women Who Whiskey Seattle. Welcome, Nikki.
Hi.
Good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm first of all going to say that I know that you are, even though you're the president of Women Who Whiskey Seattle, I know that you're not here right now because it's dark and dreary up in the Pacific Northwest. Where are you?
I'm actually in my garage in the Bay Area in Northern California. So don't be deceived by the palm trees. That literally is the background of the house before we remodeled it. And this was the only thing that we kept in here because I love it so much.
I know, it's on a dark and stormy night. It's fantastic. It's fantastic. Nikki, before we get going, could you just tell us a little bit about Women Who Whiskey for those people who maybe are tuning in and haven't heard of that organization before?
Sure. It's basically kind of an experimental social club that started in New York about 9 years ago. And now we have over 11,000 members. I started the Seattle chapter and the Bay Area chapter both at the end of 2018. And it's a free club for women that basically want to learn about whiskey from just, brand new experiences to seasoned experts. So everybody's welcome, and you actually don't need to be a woman. We also have a gentleman's edition. So everybody's welcome, and we love to partner with folks like Wanderback.
Yes, and actually that brings us to the last time I saw you in person was at our Women Who Whiskey tasting in Seattle, and it was literally the day before everything got shut down. I think we may have been like the last event. We were at Tom Douglas's restaurant, and I think it quite possibly would have been the last event in Seattle.
Yeah. It was. I mean, we just squeezed under. We had 50 people, which was the maximum at the time, and you will forever have a huge place in my heart for it being the last in-person event that we've done. So very, very fond memories and lots of love for you guys. It was a really fantastic day. And sadly, we haven't been able to get together since then. So looking forward to
when
those.
When we do, it will be amazing. I know.
Absolutely.
It makes me feel a little bit sad thinking about that because it was so fun. We had such a good time. Anyway, I'm delighted that you are here. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to hop off and leave you guys to it. And then in the next 20 or 30 minutes when we're all done, I'll come back on again.
Great. Thanks, Sasha.
Best of luck.
All right. Thank you, Nikki, for being here. This is so much fun. I'm so glad that you're joining me for this. So let's talk about how we prepare for a tasting. Some basics as we go through, we'll start with, and then if anyone has any comments or questions for either of us or Wanderback in general, please just ask a question in the comment. We'll be happy to answer them. And we'd love to get your feedback as we go through and the tasting notes as well. It's really fun to do this as a group, and since we can't do it, in person, let's do it together virtually. So, Nikki, so when I set up a tasting, I have a couple different glass options. Do you have a preferred glass that you like to use?
Well, I mean, typically I use a Glencairn glass. And by the way, I'm completely frozen, so I can't see anything that you guys are doing right now. Sorry, okay. I'm assuming that you can see me and that you can hear me. So, but yes. I typically use a Glencairn, but usually anything that kind of has a wider bottom or kind of that, tulipy shape is typically used. But honestly, I mean, I've drank whiskey out of the bottle too, straight. So we're not going to get too picky here tonight.
Yeah, any vessel is a good vessel for whiskey. Exactly. Let's be honest. Another option, if you don't happen to have a Glencairn glass, although whiskey lovers tend to have cabinets full of them. If you don't, a wine glass is a really great substitute. You just want this kind of curved shape and anything that can also help you from warming the whiskey in your hand. So this is just to really help the aromas come to your nose. Some other things that might be handy as you're going along in a tasting is having, a glass of water next to you. I can also recommend if you happen to have a little dropper, if you want to add drops of water. Just got to be careful when you pour water in your glass. You might end up proofing it down to something a little lighter than you're looking for, or you can always use a straw and just use that little trick if you need something else to add some water. So we'd also recommend to just start without any ice. Ice can be a really great additive to any whiskey, especially there's some days where you just want a big glass of bourbon with a big hunk of ice in it. But it's always best to try it neat first because there is a chemical reaction that happens with ice and it actually changes the flavor. And be as comfortable as possible. Make it a fun little event. We like to, here at home, we like to turn on some easy listening music, some jazz or something, just to make it comfortable and casual. I don't know if you have anything that you like to do, Nikki.
Oh, yacht rock. Pandora Yacht Rock Station all day long. A little air supply. It's perfect. Perfect.
Sounds great. So then we're just gonna, then you pour your whiskey, and if you have multiples, I would also recommend, if you do have multiple whiskeys to taste, to pour them and then save a little bit of them at the end of the tasting to go back and compare, because contrasting is really the fun part about it. And I feel like you can learn a lot about a whiskey, one as it sits and then as you compare as well. But we're just going to do the one tonight. So we're going to start with our Batch 4, which is a bottle that we just released in October, and it is fantastic. So just some other basics on how to taste. We are going to start with our whiskey and give it just a little bit of a swirl. And put it about an inch away from your nose or so. You can get your nose really in there if you want, but it can also overwhelm you if the alcohol is a little too much and you kind of, it gets to be too strong. You can always sniff your hand or your arm to just sort of reset your nose, unless you're wearing a bunch of Axe body spray or something like that. It's not useful, but otherwise that's a really great way to reset your nose. And so, give a little bit of a swirl. Does anyone have any, I see a question here. Thoughts on cold whiskey stones? Great question. I think it's really the temperature change that affects the chemicals in whiskey that can alter the flavor. So again, maybe try it without the stones first, and then you can add them and see how it changes it. You might like it better that way, but just start neat first and then add those later.
Yeah,
all right,
I
so
have some whiskey stones that someone gave me, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and I still haven't taken them out of the box. So I have nothing to add to that, but yes, temperature does make a difference in the experience for sure.
mm-hmm. And some other tools that we might suggest before we actually really start sipping here as a little bit of a tease is our tasting wheel. So this is something that we like to use. And Maggie, if you want to pop that up, thank you. This is something that, as Sasha said, Phil used when he was at Heriot Watt. And it's a really helpful tool to help you describe what it is that you're nosing and you're tasting, because sometimes that's the most challenging part. You have a whiskey that you're really enjoying, it's really great, and someone asks you, well, what does it taste like? Describing that can be really tricky sometimes. So this is one way to just help you do that. So the way it works is you start from the inside. So these are going to be the larger flavor profiles, and then you're going to work your way out to sort of refine your flavor as we go. And we do have a cutout that we'll come back to as we are actually tasting Batch 4 as an example. And we do have, I think in the chat, we have a link up for that if you want to pull that up on your own computers at home or have it to reference later, because these are tools that you can use for any whiskey, not just ours, of course. I have a tasting wheel that I use this wheel all the time when I'm tasting at home, just to help, again, refine what it is and describe what it is that we're tasting and nosing. So let's get into Batch 4. Let's do it. You've been sitting here with us. So we give it a swirl, and we have in our glass 6-year-old, 48.5% ABV, and it's been matured for 3 years in New American Oak and then 3 years in an ex-bourbon cask. So those are our dates on this, and it's our oldest whiskey to date. Beautiful bottle also.
I like to also just look at the color too. And it's kind of funny when we're just tasting, the first one or the Batch 4, but when you have other expressions, you can kind of tell the difference in the color just based off of whether it's coming from the wood.
Yeah, it can be really fun if you have a sherry finished, a port finish, and it might have that red color too. And it's just, for those of you out there who are new to whiskey too, there might be something where whiskeys, it's always going to be a similar color, and sometimes you can add color to whiskey also. So sometimes it can be indicative of, to tell you more about the story of the whiskey, like a sherry finish, port finish, etc. But sometimes it's just, it doesn't change the flavor, but just for consistency, they might add a caramel coloring. So, and darker whiskey is not always better whiskey, so keep that in mind too. All right, so as we're going into this, Nikki, what are you getting on your first nose here?
Well, I think one of the things that comes across first, if this is like your first smell of the whiskey, for me, like going off the wheel, I get more of the estery, but then the second or third, smell, it comes into more of like a vanilla, more oak. So it's kind of like if I walked into a nail salon that was burning vanilla candles or something. That's kind of what I finally get to.
Yeah, that's a really great description, and I like that little mini story. That's something too where this is always a really personal experience for everyone. So if it reminds you of something, because memories are, scent memories are extremely strong. So if it's something where you go, oh my gosh, this reminds me of my grandma's apple pie. Wow, I hadn't thought about that for years. Or, oh, I was sitting in my dad's chair in his study all the time, or something like that, or a particular experience that can really help you, again, refine and kind of figure out what it is that you're actually smelling or tasting. So I really like that you brought up some of those notes. And Maggie, can we pull up just a section of the wheel? Other lower bit. Yeah, so if we're looking, it might be a little hard to read, but for those of you at home, you can zoom in on it on your own. We have the sweet. So we talked about the sweetness here. And if you look at that little quadrant, there's honey, vanilla, and caramel. And you say, oh, okay, there's definitely some vanilla, and maybe what kind of vanilla? Is it ice cream or custard, or even more chocolatey? And that kind of flavor. Or then caramel, is it burnt sugar or more of a nutty caramel? There's a lot of different options. And again, this is just a way to help you sort of define what it is that you're tasting. Thank you, Andy. Another tool that we like to use that can sometimes be helpful to read when you don't have a wheel in your hand is a tasting panel that we created that's for American single malt, and it's pretty specific to Wanderback too. So yeah, thank you. It functions the same way. So if you work left to right, so we have the big flavors on the left, and then it refines more as we go on the right. So something for me when I'm nosing batch 4, I get some spices. I'm like, okay, what kind of spices? We have baking spices or savory spices. Well, for me, it can be a combo. I get some black pepper is in there, and it can be some of the other, cinnamon and gingery notes too. So this is just another tool that functions very similarly and just a helpful way to help you describe. Looking at this, do you have anything that stands out to you, Nikki, with batch 4? Because I have a couple other ones too.
I mean, I definitely get the spice. I don't know if that was just your suggestion, but definitely you have like pumpkin pie, maybe because Thanksgiving's around the corner. Absolutely the pepper. Mm-hmm. And just like some of the more just, I guess, technically estery notes still. I'm still getting that pretty strongly. But yeah, I mean, the interesting thing to me is just about like how different it actually tastes though than what I'm smelling, because I wouldn't describe smelling like malt or chocolate, but I definitely taste that when I drink it. So I love that about whiskey. Like you can be totally like mind blown. You're smelling this one thing and then it tastes completely different. So
yeah, I would agree. And on this one specifically, like on the nose, I almost get like, it's very subtle, but like a little fresh peach, and then this like fragrant honey, and then the spices and the oak is pretty prominent to me, but then it doesn't taste like that. It doesn't taste like a peach pie or anything, although that'd be great. I haven't had dinner yet. That's sounding really awesome.
Exactly. I think we're hungry.
So I haven't sipped it yet, but let's do that. So we have, if anyone has any other notes they want to add that we haven't touched on yet, as you're sipping along, that would be fabulous. We'd love to hear from you, because there is no wrong answer. Everyone's nose and palate are very unique to them. And like Nikki was already demonstrating, power of suggestion is very strong too. So when you hear or read these like huge tasting notes, like, okay, that might be someone who's like describing it to a group, and then it becomes this rolling stone of adjectives.
Right.
Yeah, so on this one, we also get some, we already talked about vanilla. There's also like a salted caramel on this too that's pretty prominent. The salinity is kind of interesting to me. That's something you often get on like coastal scotches, but not as, I think, common in American single malt.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is a big difference too. You mentioned if you have a dropper, adding a drop of water to it to kind of open it up further. And the flavor becomes completely different than what that first taste is without it. That's the one thing that I love about this, how to kind of open that up, and you taste more and more of what I think, the distiller's intention was around creating batch 4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not always about proofing it down so you don't get an alcohol burn. It does kind of alter the flavor slightly, which is, you're right, it's a really fun experience. And also if you have a whiskey that you're starting to lose the aroma on it, when you put some drops of water on it, that breaks up the oils and it sort of refreshes the aromas. So it's another way to kind of restart that. And experience in a different way. I would agree that I feel like water can bring out some of those, as you say, estery notes. So what we mean by that when we say that, esters is really another way to describe fruity notes that are coming out of a whiskey, and it can come from a couple different places. It can come from the yeast that's used, it can come from the actual distillation process, or it also comes from the transformative process of maturation. And all of these different areas, which, we might touch on later in other whiskey Wanderback lives, that those factors all come into play to create these notes, which is a really fun experiment.
Yeah, I mean, the panel and the wheel are awesome. I was saying earlier, like the wheel is probably one of the most detailed, descriptive wheels that I've seen for any sort of whiskey by far. I mean, probably the best advice I would give is just literally smell everything you can. Smell everything possible. Like, I mean, not to be too gross, but anything that you're cooking, smell the spices, smell leather, books. I mean, all the things that you can smell, because there is definitely like a distinct, scent, as well as obviously the memory around it. But really being able to identify, oh, there's grass, like there's mint, there's peach, there's this. One of the things that I have is literally like a box of, I think, 34 different scents. And I've trained myself a little bit to be able to take each of those, dip the little piece of paper in there, smell it. Okay, that's butter, that's, grass, or whatever it would be. But you have to really, really train yourself. I mean, it at least for me, it's hard to be able to pick out some of the things that seem intuitive to you, Anna, that you can kind of identify those. I have to really get it. And then, of course, constantly smelling, the arm to clear the scent.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something too that I actually did this the other day, where I was trying to figure out what sort of baking spice it was. So I went into my cabinet and grabbed cloves and nutmeg and cinnamon and opened them all up. Like, okay, what is this? And yeah, like you said, it just takes practice. It's the same thing where, when I will totally admit, when I started out my whiskey journey, I was like, yep, this tastes like whiskey. And it just takes more time and practice. Oh no, you need to drink more whiskey. How terrible. And it also changes by the time of day and what you've eaten before. Like there's a lot of different factors. And none of it's wrong. It's just figuring out what you like best and how it changes the whiskey. And something we haven't touched on actually that I just realized, we haven't talked about mouthfeel at all. And that's something too that you were talking about, looking at color, and then we go into sipping the whiskey and you have it, how it actually feels in your mouth. So some whiskeys are really, really rich and oily and like coat the tongue completely and then just hang around it. It almost feels like you have butter in your mouth or something really oily. There are some that can be really thin and that just sort of, and it has a really quick finish too. It's just like flavor dissipates. I'd say this is a pretty medium one to me, but what do you think? Do you have any more?
Yeah, it definitely isn't thin, and nor is it oily. I'd say right in the middle, but there is a distinct like bam in your mouth. At least for me, like I get a big punch of flavor, especially like if I hold it more like at the tip of my tongue versus toward the back. So that's another way you can kind of experiment a little bit with just playing around and holding it in different places of your mouth, because there are different, I guess, taste buds or whatever that you would get. It makes a different experience for sure.
Yeah, and that's something, actually, it'll be a little hard to see on the wheel, but we only have a couple primary tastes. So we have bitter, salty, sour, and sweet. And that's, kind of amazing that it's out of just those couple, we can still experience this range of flavors. And that's exactly what we are getting. And you might also, in the mouthfeel, there might be some astringency too on some finishes. We don't get that here so much, but if you're drinking like a red wine and the tannins like dry out your mouth and you get that pucker, that's another kind of experience of that. And I think we just had one actually last night that was doing that in my mouth that had a little more astringency to it. And it's interesting how those all kind of vary. Does anyone have any other notes they'd like to add? Like, this is really geeky stuff and it's super fun.
Hi. I am joining. My glass is much more empty than we started, and my wheel has been much used. But I was gonna. I think we're just gonna put up like the official tasting notes, and everyone's tasting notes are different. But I think one of the things that we love to talk about, Anna, in our virtual tastings is where we think some of the notes might be coming from, because we have this amazing journey that the whiskey goes on. And I always love, you were saying, Nikki, about tasting it in different places in your mouth, but those different flavors, I think, really talk to the journey that the whiskey's been on. So we start with our malt and our malted mash bill with our specialty malts. And then we move into new oak. And then for this double oaked whiskey, it then went into previously used bourbon cask. So, and I wonder if you have a sense of where you would link some of those kind of notes to, and you, Nikki, in terms of that journey, because what we're trying to do is kind of layer on complex flavors that work together through every part of a whiskey's kind of journey. And so that's the bit that I always find super fascinating. I wonder if we could kind of get your guys' view on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to speak to that. I think that's something really fun to talk about, specifically with Wanderback, because each of the batches have their own different layers, but the core is always the same, which is what makes it so fun. We have, the caramel notes that I find are always throughout in these baking spices. To me, that comes from the specialty malts that we use, and particularly the pale chocolate malt. You can get some of that spice from there, and the Munich malt, crystal malt can give some of those caramely notes that you don't always get from like a pale malt, for example.
Right.
And then after we've, it's now into maturation. Also from even going back further, we get some these estery notes from the actual fermentation too, and the distillation. Right. So we might get some fruitier notes, or those sweeter, even some vanillas, but some of those lighter, sweeter notes are from the earlier parts of the process. But then as we move into the maturation, that's one thing that we really love to be focused on at Wanderback, because we experiment with these different barrels. And New American Oak is, all of our whiskeys start out in New American Oak, and that gives a pretty specific flavor profile. And I think, Nikki, you can definitely speak to this, because New American Oak is used primarily in bourbon. So, we get vanilla from it, heavy in the vanilla. And what else would you say comes from that? There's a couple other ones, I think, from New American Oak, but specifically that.
To me, the thing that stands out with Batch 4, though, is the malt. I mean, definitely the malt. So I can see like how your process, that's such a prominent, and it's the very first thing that I taste. And then like it goes into, like you said, the finishing between the new oak and then the ex-bourbon casks. But yeah, it's wonderful and complex, and yeah, really, really interesting. So it's nice to hear that like the taste follows kind of your process.
Right. I think that's one of the, it's fun not only to be able to identify tastes, but then to also link them back to how the product was crafted and created, is, I think, really fascinating.
Yeah, and I would go ahead.
How much does like the distiller's beer taste like? You could follow kind of the progression from the distiller's beer to the new make to what you've ended up here.
Yeah, I think Phil would be better placed to answer that, but I have heard him talk about it, because obviously when he was creating kind of that mash bill and playing around with that recipe, he was hoping it's like he was making this, he kind of talks about that kind of Newcastle brown ale, that really dark great ale with all those kind of complex flavors in, and he was definitely looking for a taste profile that would then carry through to the whiskey. Obviously, it changes, but I think that there is definitely a link between that initial mash, that initial beer that's made, and what you taste. And again, especially in this one, because we haven't done a kind of a wildly different finishing cask on it.
Yeah, and I would say that since we then ended it in an ex-bourbon, which is not as, I don't even want to say not as flavorful, but it doesn't add as many other flavors as like the rum cask or the port cask that we use in batch 2 and 3. But ex-bourbon can still add some of those more rounded notes of the vanilla and some of the oak that you get in there. Like, oh, that's been aging a while, and that's lovely. I always like to tell people too, and maybe Nikki, you can speak to this, if bourbon lovers are new to American single malt, I would point them to this whiskey. Yeah. I feel like it's a good crossover whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this and number 1, those are my two favorites of Wanderback. So, and I do come from a bourbon background and love bourbon, but American single malt is fastly becoming one of my favorites for sure.
Well, we're happy to hear that. Very happy to hear that. Awesome. Well, I think that this has been amazing. I, for one, have learned a ton, and I have loved listening to you too. Are we good to make it a wrap?
I think so. I'll keep sipping on my whiskey on the dork and stormy night.
So thank you, Nikki. Please check out Women Who Whiskey, the Seattle chapter, and Nikki specifically on Instagram at Bourbon Maven. Maybe one day we'll meet you at American Single Malt Maven as an alternative.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
You can have dueling accounts and see how they do. And Anna, it's always lovely to see you. So thank you, everybody who has been tuned in. I hope you learned something. Please hit us up with any questions. You can always reach us at info@wanderback.com, and have a very happy Wednesday evening.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.